In 1972, October 1, all private institutions were nationalized. Schools, colleges, didn't matter, they were all nationalized. In other words, they came under government control. So, when before October 1972, when the country had the option of allowing its children to go and receive a private education versus a public education, now all education was to be public. Pros and cons to both. There are advantages and disadvantages. We can debate on this. Lots of debates have happened. Was this a good move, not a good move? Yes, it was. No, it wasn't. That's not the point. The point now is that this is what the government decided. Once the government decided to take over all these private institutions, what were the next steps? Now, when the government took these private institutions over, the owners of those institutions were paid nothing and they got no other form of compensation. Nothing. The government just walked in and said, "You step out, these are ours now." Not a wise thing to do because it made a lot of people, at least the owners, quite unhappy. You suddenly told individuals you did not have a livelihood anymore and the government was going to run the institutions on the government lines. Now, if you look at the government perspective, the government realized that the private school owners were doing three things. Number one, charging high fees from students. Not a wise thing to do, but they were. They're not paying teachers enough. So really, the private school owner was interested in making money for himself or herself at the expense of students, at the expense of teachers. When the government took these institutions over and teachers started getting government type of salaries, many teachers were happy and the students were not, because the quality of education suddenly went down. For whatever reasons, maybe there was a hindrance, maybe there were barriers, maybe people were really not ready, parents were not ready to send children to public institutions, and so no retaliation happened. There was no protest about it, but still what was seen was some people were happy and some were not. Now, the 1972 policy with all institutions nationalized, okay, no private institutions across the country. A few institutions over time were handed back, some as early as maybe a year or two after being nationalized, some 30, 40 years later, have been returned because the government realized that it was too much. Subsequent governments realized that it was too much of a burden to bear on the government's part. And so they handed these back so that at least some children, people who could afford it, could still continue to get a good quality education within the country. This nationalization period of time was a sign for the government as to what they could do or could not do with education in Pakistan. You had to have a commitment. Maybe if the 1972 government had continued longer, they had the commitment. They decided to nationalize the institutions, and maybe if that government had continued longer, we might have seen a different turnaround with nationalized institutions. Subsequent governments may have taken this as a burden, may have taken this, now we have to deal with so many institutions, pay so many teachers, there's only so much money in the budget, and so on, and so standards deteriorated. And as standards deteriorated, the subsequent governments, as they came about, decided to hand these institutions back to the owners so that some semblance of education could continue within the country.